Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are grateful to be in this virtual community with you. My name is Sierra Keeler Jones, and I'm the Executive Director at Rethinking Schools. Today's conversation will highlight stories, examples, and concrete strategies for teaching truthfully and critically about Palestine and Israel. At a time when the attacks on social justice teaching have dramatically expanded as part of the crackdown on the opposition to United States aid to Israel, it is essential that we support and learn from one another. And so I am honored to introduce my comrade and friend, Jesse Hagopian, editor at Rethinking Schools, who will guide our conversation tonight. Jesse, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sierra. Really appreciate you for organizing this event. And thanks to everybody who is joining us today for this crucial conversation. I'm so glad to be with you all today. It feels really good to be part of a community of people in solidarity with Palestine on this Nakba Day, a remembrance of the catastrophe that was inflicted on Palestinians on May 15th, 1948. And Nakba Day is a day to reflect on the ethnic cleansing that occurred in the establishment of Israel when over 530 Palestinian villages were destroyed, many Palestinians massacred, and 750,000 survivors forced to flee and become refugees. Some Palestinian historians have put the number closer to 900,000. And I read an article by Abir Barakat in The Nation today. She wrote, quote, "I have been displaced 11 times since the start of Israel's bloody campaign against Gaza. My husband, my 4 kids, and I flee from one neighborhood in Gaza to another, trying to stay ahead of the bombs, sheltering with relatives and friends. Each time we flee, fragments of my grandmother's stories from 1948 come to mind." As Macklemore put it in his new song, Heinz Hall, named after a 6-year-old Palestinian girl who was murdered by Israel. He said, quote, "History has been repeating for the last 75. The Nakba never ended. The colonizer lied." The occupation of Palestine is an ongoing catastrophe that has been perpetrated by the U.S. Support of Israel. And as Palestinian historian Abdul Razik Tarakati said of the Nakba this morning on Democracy Now, quote, "It's not enough to commemorate. It's not enough to talk about. We have to stop it right now. The first step to doing that is to stop the genocide in Gaza." This is a genocide bought and paid for by U.S. tax dollars. The bombs dropping on the hospitals, the schools, the mosques in Gaza are provided by the U.S. government. And in the latest assault on Gaza, Israel has now killed 14,500 children, over 35,000 people, and 73% of all schools in Gaza have been directly hit or damaged by weapons made in the USA. This is the truth. It's a hard truth. But however hard, students deserve not to be lied to. When educators love their students enough to teach them the truth, and when it's a hard truth, they are there to nurture them through the lessons with tenderness. I really believe that transcendent experiences are possible that empower young people to heal from the traumas that they endure and to create healthy and thriving futures that they can envision. And I gained perspective on the struggle for a free Palestine when I joined Eyewitness Palestine's African Heritage Delegation back in 2011. And I joined a group of Black faith leaders, organizers, activists, some of whom were veterans of the civil rights movement. And we traveled to Jerusalem and to the West Bank and seeing Israel and Palestine through the eyes of people who had lived through and fought against Jim Crow apartheid really changed my life. One of the members of our delegation was a Black woman named Gloria Brown, who was among the first group of teachers to integrate a school in Kemper County, Mississippi. And when she showed up for work the first day after the courts had ordered a desegregation of the schools, uh, the school was surrounded by the Ku Klux Klan on horseback with shotguns. And they returned every day for weeks to keep her and her colleagues out. And Gloria and others on this delegation told me that the apartheid that they saw on our trip in Palestine and Israel was worse than what they experienced in the Jim Crow South. We were not allowed entry into Gaza during that trip, but we did go to a hill in Sderot, and we were able to see over the apartheid wall into Gaza. And while we were there, the elders in our delegation broke out into song, adapting a Black freedom struggle song. They sang, "Like an olive tree standing by the water, we shall not be moved." And that moment of truly feeling the connection between the Palestinian struggle and the Black freedom movement has sustained me as an educator in this struggle for a free Palestine. And it's been hard work to be in this struggle, especially for educators. Educators in the US who are unwilling to turn their classrooms into a press conference for Israel's far-right Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, have faced harsh censure. The attacks on teachers who dare to teach about Palestine or even just provide multiple perspectives on the bombing of Gaza, right, have faced a wave of right-wing attacks on teaching the truth about all kinds of subjects. We've seen attacks on teachers who teach about Palestine, but also teachers who teach about racism, about gender, about sexuality. Today in America, almost half of all teachers face some kind of gag order that requires them to lie to students about systemic racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. Rethinking Schools' newest magazine is titled Teach Palestine, and in the editorial of that magazine, we connected the attacks on teaching about race and teaching about Palestine. The editors wrote, quote, "Like the educators removed from teaching about racial justice or creating safe and welcoming spaces for LGBTQ plus youth, many of the teachers accused of anti-Semitism are veteran educators with long histories of fighting racism and oppression. We at Rethinking Schools are in solidarity with the brave educators teaching the truth about Palestine and the students who are walking out of class or forming encampments to demand an immediate ceasefire as well as an end to the occupation. And as challenging as it can be to teach truth about Palestine in the current period, as Rethinking Schools editorialized, quote, "We should understand and take hope in the reason that this backlash has grown in intensity. More people than ever are refusing to stay quiet in the face of racism and injustice." And I want to introduce you now to some of those people who are refusing to back down. We have assembled a brilliant panel to help us understand how to teach Palestine. I also want to say before I introduce them that we are very fortunate to be joined by ASL interpreters Crystal Butler and Tiara Carter. Thank you so much for making this event accessible. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Susanna Kassouf, who teaches social studies in the Portland Public Schools, is a 2024 to 2026 Zinn Education Project Prentice Charney Fellow, and is co-founder of Ceasefire Chorus PDX. Welcome. Thanks for being with us. We also are joined today by Nassim Zarifi, who teaches history, current events, and leads activism projects at Manhattan Country School. He also works with the New York Collective of Radical Educators, where he co-led workshop series on teaching and organizing for Palestine, as well as on combating Islamophobia. Welcome. We are also joined today by Samia Shoman, who is a California native with Palestinian roots and has dedicated the last 24 years of her career in public education to promoting racial and social justice in the classroom. She is the co-coordinator of the Middle East Children's Alliance Teach Palestine project and has developed curriculum and published various articles focused on teaching Palestine. Welcome. And finally, we are joined by Keziah Ridgway, an award-winning educator, author, activist, mother, and wife, born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She is a member of the Racial Justice Organizing Committee, curriculum writer, professional development coordinator, and 2020 Lindback Distinguished Teacher Award winner. Thank you all so much for joining me. We are going to jump right into the conversation because we have a lot to get through. But I want to begin by asking you all to share a powerful moment from your classroom teaching about Palestine, or if you have a story about student organizing and activism that inspires you, feel free to share that.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Keziah Ridgway. So I am a teacher here in Philadelphia, and I would have to say one of the most powerful moments for me this year was I teach African American history, and we were learning about resistance art from African Americans during the time of enslavement. And I introduced them to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's Bury Me in a Free Land. And we also learned about how African Americans, or I should say African, use drums in order to either tell a story or communicate, etc. So after learning about this, I assigned a project where I had my students create a podcast, but the caveat was that they had to connect resistance art used by African Americans during enslavement with resistance art currently used by indigenous and or oppressed peoples within the last 15 years. I got a lot of amazing entries. Students did things like talk about capoeira, but probably the best project that I've ever gotten was this one podcast where I had two students work on it. One of the students I teach, the other student I did not teach. He actually heard about the subject and he learned it was a podcast and he was like, I want to do this too, even though I'm not getting credit. And so for this particular podcast, my student had chose Palestinian resistance art and connected it to African Americans and their resistance art during enslavement. And I was so worried about this project because I know that it required a high level of analyzation and thinking skills. And these students, I should say, knocked it out of the park. They were able to seamlessly and concisely connect the importance of using art as a form of resistance to Palestinians and to African Americans. And for me, that highlighted the importance of giving your students projects that allow them to critically think, to make connections, not just from the past, but also what's going on in the present. Now, unfortunately, this podcast got me in trouble, but I do not regret it. I would assign it all over again because I think that it is important for our students to learn how to critically think in this climate, especially when they are wanting our students to be puppets and to go along with propaganda.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for your courage and for teaching the truth.
I am going to build on Keziah had like all these examples. I'm no longer in the classroom, but for many, many years in my contemporary world studies class taught about, I wrote a curriculum teaching Palestine and Israel through multiple perspectives. lens. And at the end, kids, we put on a United Nations conference, and they were tasked with coming up with solutions to what was happening. And it's amazing, young people and their forward thinking and ability to critical think. So there were 5 issues. So they had to do a map, like how are you going to assign land, or are you? Because some students chose to have one democratic country, others decided to split it up. So they had to create that. They had to address the issues of water, the issues of Jerusalem, the issues of refugees, and then and kind of like the borders and the wall. And then they would put up their proposal, and there was a whole kind of protocol and, like, questioning and then negotiating to see if they could at the end come up with an agreement on like one groups or pieces of different groups proposal to kind of solve what's happening. I also did that through the lens of the same thing, but having students take on a country, a stakeholder country. So there's Israel, there's, representatives of Palestine, and they had to decide who they were going to be. Were they going to be the Palestinian Authority? Were they going to be the actual people? And then the United States and Lebanon and people that, kind of European countries. And so I would just go back to, when you put things in the hands of young people, their ability to get back to thinking about all perspectives and the humanity, right, of people and what brings them together, produce some pretty amazing critical thinking, analysis, reading. And even those kids who, don't like the way school is done because schools were not built for them, would get so engaged in this more than anything else. So
awesome. Thanks for all the work you've done to create curriculum around this.
These stories are amazing. I want to share a story of student activism and organizing. So there's 2 things that happened last March that really inspired me. Students throughout my district organized a walkout for peace. And then on the same day, there's a Students for a Democratic Society club at my high school that they organized a teach-in about the conflict and about what's been happening since October 7th. And actually, Sierra's going to drop in the chat an article about the walkout, because for the sake of time, I don't really have time to talk about both. But I will say that for both of these, I was just honestly stunned by the moral courage of these students who faced a lot of organized backlash. And they just stood so strong and just refused to dehumanize anyone, refused to blame Jewish people for the actions of Israel, refused to back down and say that, Palestinian lives don't matter. And I was just so impressed. But I want to talk a little bit about the teaching at my school. So the students asked me to support them, and I just supported them by helping them find like a quick video that's like an overview of the history, which Sierra will also drop in the chat. But I was just, the rest of the presentation was all from them. And I was really stunned. It was like impeccably researched, just so accurate, so well researched. It was, I thought, really smart of the students. They spent a lot of time talking about what's been happening in the West Bank since October 7th, because we know there's no Hamas in the West Bank, and yet there are arrests and killings of Palestinians happening there. And they spent a lot of time talking about US funding of this genocide and US funding of the occupation, how we play a role in this. And again, I was just stunned by their compassion. Like, I think students, young people, really have an ability to hold the humanity of all people here. It's not like it's not like Jewish people versus Palestinians. It's like, this is about oppression. And they just did it so beautifully. And I just want to close by reading the last paragraph in that article that Sierra dropped in the chat. This is from one of the student organizers who organized the walkout. She said, "We're here and we're strong and we're passionate, and we're not going to stop until PPS decides to do something about it and meet our demands. We have been organizing with students across the district, and it shows me the power that we have as students and as children, and the voice that we have. It gives me hope for the future. It gives me hope that we as a society can do something, and we are going to make a change."
Beautiful. I love young people. Nassim, you take us home?
Sure. So my turn. So I teach middle school, and after October 7th, I taught my current events class about the topic, and then the kids said, we want to learn more, so we kept learning more. And one thing I did was bring up controversial questions, have them read articles from different perspectives. Then they'd have to summarize both articles and then put out their own opinion. So we did, who's responsible for the death of Palestinian civilians? Is there a genocide happening? If so, who's responsible? And then the last one was, should there be a ceasefire? And so once the assignment was due and they had made up their own opinion, that was November 9th, which was a day of action. So I put up this resource that, we're going to call the White House, we're going to call Congress. And then they also saw that there was a walkout on there. And I was like, we're not doing that part. And I made it open for them. I said, listen, you can call the White House, you can call your Congress member, you can say you want to cut funding for Israel, you want to say you should be more funding for Israel. You could say you want a ceasefire, you don't want a ceasefire, you want a humanitarian pause, you want to end the occupation, you want to support Israel 100%. Whatever you want to advocate for is your right to advocate for it. And I've made it very clear nobody can get angry at anybody else. So everyone called for a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause. They're all over the hallways, they're all over the classroom, they're making these phone calls, and they keep getting hung up on by the White House. And the people at the White House are kind of rude to them, so they're getting a little spicy in their responses. And one of my students got this brilliant idea to test, they said, we keep getting hung up on. So we called back and said that we were calling to support Israel. And then they didn't hang up on us. And they talked to us for a while. And that shows their bias. So they had come up with that on their own, right? And then another student saw that there was a walkout being planned. And they're like, well, can we, emailed me like, hey, I'd like to do this. Can you organize this with me? And I had put out a letter to my school community that got a lot of things happening. So I was like, listen, I can't help you, but I'm not going to stop you. And so I was like, just talk to your people. You want to organize a walkout? Talk to your people. And so he did. And I gave him like a little advice and little pointers here and there. And this student just organized a walkout of their peers because they're young, it's middle school. The head of school was like, called their parents, was like, some adults should take them, right? And so a few parents showed up and just brought like 15, 20 kids who walked out of school to a protest at Bryant Park that they had organized themselves. And it was just really beautiful to see them. They were so excited. The next day they came to class and they're like, can we keep making phone calls? And so they did keep making phone calls for another day. And then I showed them an article that congressional aides were talking about the pressure that they were put on to hang up on people, to lie to people who were calling on this day of action. So I said, so this was what was going on the other side, but the congressional aides also said the pressure was working. So I said, listen, you might've got hung up on, you might've been lied to, but they're telling you that it's working, so keep going.
Oh, what a beautiful lesson. Incredible work you all are doing. Thank you for sharing that. I want to ask you all now, what is central to your vision about what it means to teach Palestine? And Nassim, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think a couple things I want to say. One, humanizing Palestinians. I think Palestinians have been so dehumanized in our media landscape, just like an immediate mental association with terrorism or with oppression or what have you, that there's no kind of awareness of people outside of that context. So I think reframing that is really important. I think showing people, I think for you, Jesse, you were talking about the trip there and how eye-opening that was. And I think, video and hearing from people's voices from there is really important. And then I think this is a really good example to the point about multiple perspectives of sharing that there are multiple perspectives, but like you said, like I don't lie to my students and I don't shy away from controversial things. And I will tell them when I was talking with this, I was like, some people believe this and some people say this, right? Let's look at some facts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a conflict and so I think it's central to be brave and be honest and to humanize Palestinians and to give students enough different information that they can make up their own mind, but also help them to contextualize and frame the conversation. So for simple facts, for example, the people are talking about this conflict and the two sides and there's all this terrorism, et cetera. And I was like, what percentage of all the casualties of this entire conflict do you think are Palestinian? Right? And they're like, I don't know, 40%, 50%, like it's 95%. So while we're talking about a conflict between two sides, 95% of all the casualties are actually Palestinian. So that just helps you to, like things like that I think are really important because the media landscape here is so incredibly biased that we have to do some work to undo that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I so agree with that. I think for me, teaching Palestine is about teaching human rights and justice. So like it is my core value that every human life is precious, that like a Palestinian baby's life matters as much as an Israeli baby's life and an American baby's life or a Guatemalan baby's life or a German baby's life, etc. And our students have a right to know that, under the current system in Palestine and Israel, supposedly to protect Jewish people, Jewish babies, a Palestinian baby will be born under a system that for the rest of their life they will experience oppression. Palestinian citizens of Israel will be second class citizens. Palestinian babies born in Gaza living under a total blockade from Israel, controlling their airspace, their borders, the education they can get, the water they can drink, the medical access they can get, etc., before October 7th. And Palestinian babies born in the West Bank living under a brutal military occupation with constant checkpoints. And, they can be arrested for just looking at a soldier the wrong way. And, constant evictions and more settlers moving into the West Bank and pushing them out of their homes. And so, to me, this is about human rights and safety for all people, not just for Palestinians. Because what does it do to Israeli babies who grow up in a society where they have to have bomb shelters built in their house and where they're taught, at the most fundamental level that their lives matter more than Palestinian lives? That will never bring true safety. The only thing that can bring true safety is justice and equality. And I think that those are my fundamental values as I teach Palestine. And I'm always amazed at students' ability to be imaginative about what justice and equality could look like in this region.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to say yes and, right, to both of them. It's very simple. What's central to my vision of what it means to teach Palestine is inclusion. We're constantly and pretty consistently excluded, exceptionalized. We can teach about everything, not Palestine, because it's too controversial, it's too complicated. But what is so complicated about my humanity, about where my parents were born in 1942, what is documented on their birth certificates as Jerusalem, Palestine, and why shouldn't my own kids have an opportunity to learn about, explore their ancestry, their background in their schools? Their father, my husband, was born and raised in Jordan because his parents were refugees in 1948, the Nakba, which we're commemorating today. So our humanity does not have to come, as explained before, at the exclusion of others. Right? In talking about Palestine, whether our culture, our traditions, it doesn't always have to be contextualized in this conflict. I understand why we do that when teaching history, but we're really more than that. We're people with a rich culture who have and continue to contribute to the fabric of this world. And we also have strong connections to other Indigenous peoples' histories, settler colonial histories, other people's struggles. A few years, 2 or 3 years ago, we were back home, my kids and I, and we were in Bethlehem near the Waldorf Hotel, and there was this huge mural of George Floyd. And my son is standing next to it, and he looks at it, and he's like, "Mama, I have a question." I'm like, "Okay, what's your question?" He's like, "What do you think is worse, what's happening here or what happens to Black people in America?" Mind you, this kid was like in fifth, coming at like the summer between fifth and sixth grade. I was like, yeah, my son is smart. He was able to draw that connection. And I'm like, well, that's a very good question. I don't have an answer, but let's explore that and let's talk about it. So I also would say that my vision is when we're talking about solidarity and interconnected struggles, that students are able to make those connections because they are learning about what's happening in
Yes.
Palestine and who even Palestinians are, right? I think everyone knows now. But when I was growing up, people, and you say, "Oh, where are you from? What's your background?" You say Palestine, people look at you kind of quizzically, right? I'm not sure where.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I think it's crucial that when we teach Palestine, we teach the connection to indigenous people here on our own continent, to the Black freedom struggle and all these different struggles for justice. It's a great way to connect it and make it understandable for our youth. Thank you. Keziah?
I'm going to try to keep this like really, really brief. How could my vision not be one of intersectionality and making connections to what is happening in Palestine, and me being an African American woman, being a child of the Great Migration, a child of displacement on both sides of my family. My father was born in Alabama, my grandmother was from North Carolina. And as many of you know, millions of African Americans left the South as a result of racial violence, as a result of white terrorism, and came north to try to find more opportunities where they were met with more racial violence. And so understanding what displacement is, to a certain extent, knowing that my families had to leave the land, had to leave, and they could no longer work the land, but had to come north and be in a city environment in order to find opportunities for their future generations, for myself, is one in which I see so much shared connectedness with Palestinians. And I would have to say, like, part of that vision is also my own selfish, like, love for Palestinians. I was first introduced to Palestinians in college. And from then on, just a very special bond that I have felt with the Palestinian people. They're so warm, they're so loving. They're always trying to feed me. When I was pregnant and working at a Muslim school, like, what do you want? What do you need? I'm not hungry. No, you're gonna eat this. So just that warmness and the fact that my students, who I teach so many Palestinian students. We have like hundreds of Palestinian kids, and they're all from Mukmas, by the way. But we have hundreds of Palestinian kids in my school, and they are constantly facing Islamophobia. They're constantly facing anti-Palestinian discrimination, and they're constantly not seen and having their identities denied. And so for me, I know what it's like to also have that happen as a young outspoken Black child in public schools. And so as the teacher, my goal is to be the teacher that I didn't necessarily have in terms of history, and to be a support for my students and allow other people to see the beauty of their culture the way that I see it.
Thank you. Well, now I want to ask you all about a common refrain that we hear, that the conflict is just too complicated or too complex to address. So how do you counter that argument?
Let me. Oh, it's on my turn. You go first, Susanna. Go ahead.
Are you sure? Okay. Yeah, of course, when we hear that, I do think there are some people who genuinely feel that, and I do think that there's a lot of ways that's just a cop out. But we learn complicated things in school all the time. That's what education is. It's learning complicated things. Like gentrification is very complicated. Chemistry is it's so complicated. Climate change is extremely, extremely complicated. And school is the place to learn and untangle complicated things. And I do think there are things about this that are complicated. Like, how do we answer the question of Jewish safety? And, we can't turn back the clock now. So whether or not you think Israel should have been created, the fact is that it was created. And now there are 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians living there. So, what a future of safety and equality and justice for all of those people could look like is complicated. And I'm so interested in exploring that. And there are some things about this that are not complicated. Like, it is not complicated that there is an oppressor in this situation with power, and there is an oppressed without power. And it's not complicated when you're talking about, what's happening in Gaza, that it's wrong to kill more than 34,000 people. That's not complicated. It's not complicated that it's wrong to kill more than 14,000 children, and orphan more than 17,000 others. That's not complicated. And it's not complicated that it's wrong to bomb schools and hospitals and religious sites and just decimate Gaza. you know, these things are not complicated. And anyone who is saying that those are complicated, they're either divorced from reality or they're divorced from morality. And as a society, we need to say that we need to firmly stand in reality and we need to firmly stand in morality and say that this is wrong and not complicated.
I feel like I don't even need to add anything more, but I would say it's not complicated, it's uncomfortable. And certain people have had the privilege for so long of not being uncomfortable. And now, with the increasing of social justice teaching and with the increasing of people learning on social media, now some folks that are not used to being uncomfortable are uncomfortable. And so, what I would say is, welcome to the party. I am a Black woman. I have been uncomfortable since the day I was born. I think that in being uncomfortable and analyzing that discomfort is where the work begins and how you get from point A to point B. So for me, I teach about the Sand Creek Massacre, which is the most horrendous thing that happened to Native Americans during the Civil War. I teach about the Civil War. I teach about slavery and about the sexual assault of Black women, right? So all of this is uncomfortable. The doing and the learning is being able to sit in that discomfort. And that is what I tell my students in the beginning of every year. This is uncomfortable. Teaching about Emmett Till is uncomfortable for me. Learning about a 15-year-old child who was beaten and shot and thrown into a river is uncomfortable. Showing that image that his mother wanted the world to see that kickstarted the civil rights movement is uncomfortable, but it's not complicated. It's bad people doing bad things. And so that's what we need to learn. Why are they doing these bad things? Analyzing these bad things so that we don't continue to live in this cycle.
Thank you. Nassim, did you want to jump in?
Just real quick, I would just second everything that was beautifully said. I would say, if there is a concern about complexity, what is the source of the complexity? Is it the finding a solution? Is it the details of the history, et cetera, et cetera? And I think Israel and the United States share a really common mythology that often substitutes for history. And so that's a source of discomfort for people when they get challenged on their founding myths that are so caught up in their identity. But I would say, just like the United States, you could look at the history of the founding of the United States with all its complexity, the relationship between the Europeans and the various Native American nations, et cetera. But you can also just zoom out and say, okay, people came from Europe, they colonized through violence and genocide this land. That was their intent, that was their stated intent, that's what they did. Whatever the details were of this event or that event, that's the overall view of what happened. And with Israel, it's the same. They were very clear in their intentions from the beginning that their goal was not to show up as refugees and take refuge in Palestine and live alongside. Their goal was to expel the Arab population and to create a land only for Jewish people, and that's what they did. So we can get lost in the weeds of what happened in this meeting or this document or that document, or this leader or that leader, but the overall, when you zoom out, is very clear. Here's what we wanted to do, and here's what we did, and it's a very similar impact. So that's really not that complicated at all.
Yes, thank you for that. And for Samia, what suggestions do you have for educators who teach younger, like elementary aged students?
So yeah, I mean, I would focus on things that are age appropriate, right? And introduce them to the idea that Palestinian people exist. And no one really understood or understands what Palestine was or who Palestinians were when I was growing up. Especially because, there's the globe and then the maps that are in the classroom and we're not there. Sometimes the little space is carved out. There's a really great book, We Are Palestinian, A Celebration of Culture and Tradition. It's fairly new, that is by Reem Kassis. It's really great, I feel like, for grades 4 through 8. It has like all the different aspects of Palestinian culture, some history about like different Palestinian cities. There's a lot of young children's books that also never existed. Not even when my kids, and they're not that old, they're 13, were young. And I know on our Teach Palestine page, we have books broken down by like what's appropriate for like K through 5 and what's appropriate for middle school and high school. You can also teach a theme. If you're teaching about the theme of home, what does home mean? What does home mean now for the kids in Gaza? The people of Gaza. What does home mean when you were displaced, right? You can teach about traditions, define what is culture. You don't, it doesn't kind of, I mentioned this before, teaching about Palestine doesn't always have to revolve or involve war and violence. There are so many beautiful parts of our culture. And so I would say, connect kids to that.
Nice. That's beautiful. So now I want to get to another common objection that comes up when we teach truth about Palestine, and that is concerns about anti-Semitism. So I would love to hear how you all think about that, and those charges of anti-Semitism that are often leveled at teachers who want to teach the truth about Palestine. So Nassim, I thought I'd start with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, I just want to say off the bat, I am half Jewish and half Arab. My mom is an Ashkenazi Jew. My grandfather was a rabbi. My dad is a Muslim from Morocco. My grandfather on that side went to Mecca like 50 something times, prayed 10 times a day. So I've grown up with this dynamic. And maybe being Jewish also helps me kind of not worry so much about that charge of anti-Semitism as I think a lot of other teachers are. The first thing I would say is, what are we calling anti-Semitic? There's a lot of conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, obviously. So for example, when prospective parents were coming touring the school where I teach at, and they would come in, I'd say, here's what I'm teaching about, and here's how I'm doing it. One person emailed the head of school saying, he seemed great, but he said two things which are anti-Semitic. One, he said Palestinians living under occupation, and two, he said Israeli settlers. And those terms are anti-Semitic. And I had to email my head of school, here's things from the State Department, United States State Department, from the United Nations, from the Israeli government. These are the terms that they use. It is called an occupation. And I said, only American Jews would be confused about this. Everyone in Israel knows it's an occupation. They call it the occupation. The government calls it the occupation. So they're living under occupation, right? They are settlers living in settlements. That's what they are. Like, I don't know how that term is anti-Semitic. So from the river to the sea, people want to interpret that to mean whatever it does. So when did freedom become threatening to you? Right? And so in a context in which Israel is equated with being Jewish and with safety for Jewish people, any acknowledgement of the existence of Palestinians or the rights of Palestinians is perceived as a threat to the state of Israel, and therefore is perceived as anti-Semitic. So when someone says, we're concerned about anti-Semitism, or my daughter heard something anti-Semitic at school, I want to know first, what did they actually hear, right? Secondly, it is true that we might have, Jewish students in our class who, as I said, whose identity is so wrapped up in the state of Israel, and who have this kind of intergenerational trauma, which I will be honest with you, I also have, right? As Jewish people, the feeling of like they tried to wipe us off the earth and nobody helped us, is a real feeling that I get. But because I am both, right, I can't do what I think a lot of people do, is just close off your empathy, close off your morality to a group of people. I lost one of my best friends over this topic, and he told me, you're a real human rights for all kind of person. Most people are more tribalistic. And so I think there's a lot of people who are just raised in an environment where it's like, whatever we have to do to protect us, we're going to do, and it doesn't matter. And they just harden their hearts to the suffering of other people, right? And so how do you teach Jewish people who are going to be shocked and horrified to hear you say free Palestine, right? Or to even say that there is such a thing as Palestine? And I think we have to ask questions of those people, maintain, as was said, a human rights framework, right? That if you have principles, they apply to everybody, right? Or you don't have principles. And so if we're talking about liberation and freedom, we want that for everybody. If we're talking about safety, we want that for everybody. And so maintaining that, asking questions, giving a little space without letting anyone dominate the conversation, dealing with people's feelings as best you can, and acknowledging that for a lot of our students, this might be a many years process of undoing the Zionist propaganda that they've been raised with. And maybe you asking those questions is step one. And they're not going to get to it by the end of the year of you teaching them, but maybe 10 years down the road, right? That will be the beginning kind of chink in the armor that they start opening their eyes to other people's humanity.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Susanna?
Yeah, that was beautiful, Nassim. I think like all forms of bigotry, we really need to like look inside and reflect on how anti-Semitism shows up in our thoughts, in our words, in our actions, and in our movements. But like Nassim demonstrated so eloquently, it's very difficult to do that when you have this really dishonest weaponization of anti-Semitism that's used as like this blunt hammer to just shut down any solidarity with Palestinians or the movement for Palestinian liberation. It becomes so hard to parse out, okay, where are we seeing real anti-Semitism and what is just this is just very dishonestly being used to shut this down, where any criticism of Israel or Zionism gets labeled as automatically anti-Semitic. But I think something that's so important for us to remember is that the movement for Palestinian solidarity is full of Jews. And it's full of Jews, many of whom are not in there despite their Jewishness, but because of their Jewishness. Because Judaism is a religion that emphasizes justice. And for many Jewish people, they have, like Nassim said, that intergenerational trauma that gives them this visceral understanding of oppression and of genocide. And some people, that trauma makes them shut down and want to just protect themselves and protect their own people. But for many people, it makes them want to interrupt wherever they see oppression and genocide happening in the world, especially when it's being enacted in their names, supposedly for their own benefit. So when we see extreme repression of the Palestinian movement for solidarity, we forget that that repression is often targeted at Jews who are in that movement protesting for Palestinian liberation. And, I really believe that it's my job as a teacher who has many Jewish students to separate the two, to separate Israel from Jewish people, because Israel is out there and many Jewish institutions are out there saying there is no separation. They are the same. It's core to Jewish identity to support and love Israel. And then at the same time, students are looking at their phones and they're seeing like the worst things that they've ever seen in their lives, like babies, like children, like crying over their dead parents, or like parents who are like holding their children wrapped in white sheets. Like students are seeing this. And then you have Israel saying, we speak for all Jews. Like, how is that going to bode well for increasing or decreasing anti-Semitism in the world? And so it is so important for us as teachers to separate those two things and to say, no, Israel is not doing, this is not happening because they're Jewish. This is happening because of power. And this is happening because of systems that allow people to go to these extremes. And so we need to separate those two, not just for Palestinians, but for Jewish people as well, and for our Jewish students.
That's right. So well said. And we are running so short on time. I don't know if anyone else wanted to say something very briefly, but we're going to have to move pretty quickly through our last couple questions. Can I move ahead? All right. Very well said. There have been brutal attacks on Palestinian students around the country, and I was hoping y'all could talk about the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian hate that's happening right now in this country, especially for students. Keziah, did you want to start? And just everyone be aware we got to be pretty concise to get through the session.
I would say that one of the things that I am finding increasingly annoying is the fact that we are not speaking about Islamophobia, and we're not speaking about anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, Arab discrimination. And I think that is doing a disservice. I think another disservice to my students and to Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students in school systems across the country. I think another thing that we have to think about is the fact that a lot of times Arabs are immediately, or they're classified as white. And so that allows for school districts around the country to decide, like, we're not even going to address Arab discrimination because we don't even have the proper numbers in order to be able to see how many of those kids are in our schools, right? And so I think there needs to be a concerted effort to address the fact that we're using data from the United States government to characterize Arabs. That's number one. And then number two, having been on the receiving end of Islamophobia since the moment I started teaching at my school and witnessing Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab discrimination from the moment I started at my school, it's not anything new, but it has grown exponentially. And I think that we need to be talking about the fact that the media is not giving the same amount of coverage to Islamophobia and anti-Arab and Palestinian discrimination as they are anti-Semitism, and that is bias in and of itself.
Excellent. Anybody else want to weigh on this very quickly?
I'm just going to quickly say, CARE, which is the Council of American Islamic Relations, has documented the highest number of Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian hate issues, crimes, complaints, school, places of work in all of their history. And I get so many stories from families asking me, like, what should I do? How do I talk to the school? What's the rules? What's the laws? That are not even getting reported. So I can't imagine. I can go on and talk about like incidents at my own kid's school, of which in 3 months there were 3 major ones, and very dismissive. So it's also interesting and kind of goes back to that piece around the media of like also sites when it's somebody Palestinian or somebody Muslim or somebody that's like both. It's very dismissive of what's happening.
Yeah. And with Islamophobia, we saw a 6-year-old kid be stabbed to death in Chicago. We've seen Palestinian students attacked, and one left now unable to walk, right? It's been brutal Islamophobic attacks, and there's no doubt that anti-Semitism is on the rise too, but it's coming from the right wing. It's coming from folks that want to ban Anne Frank's diary, and not from our movement for Palestinian liberation. Thank you all so much for that. I want to ask you now about Palestinian culture and history that's often severely repressed in US media and in education. So, can you all briefly tell us about beautiful parts of Palestinian culture and history that every educator and student should know about?
Well, I could talk about our food, but I think people already know about that. And I think Isaiah mentioned it. And it's so funny how people like will criticize like what's happening or get into like all the politics, but they still love to eat our food. But I'm going to talk about collectiveness, family, hospitality, and sharing that's connected to food, right? You see food kitchens. I've seen them in El Khalil, which is Hebron, in Gaza right now, as a way of showing community care. I know, like, I try to cook for my staff, or when I was growing up, friends wanted to come to my house for group projects. What did your mom make? So I would say that is something that has become a form of resistance. You've seen like all these cookbooks emerge, tons more restaurants that never existed. Um, and I see it in my own kids when when we're going to my mom's house about 2 hours from us, and they're like, "What do you think she made? Do you think she made warak dawali, which are stuffed grape leaves?" And because they see it as a love note when she does, she always does it for them. And so I would say, yeah, that hospitality, that collectiveness, and the show of caring and love through it.
Really quickly, I'm going to say Depke or Depche, depending on where in Palestine folks are from, or I should say in the Arab world, actually, Minna. But Depke. I love trying to learn how to dance it. I do not a good job, but I love the way that my students light up when they're doing that and when they're dancing. And that just makes me so happy. And like really quickly, What I loved about our last multicultural show is that the Sudanese students did a dance for the first time at our show. And then at the end, they brought out the Palestinian flag and Palestinian students, and they did a little deska off the stage. So I thought that was like beautiful solidarity and just a way to share the culture in a positive way.
I'm just going to shout out the resilience of the Palestinian people who have for decades now been fighting for their freedom. The media loves to cover when this fighting is in violent ways, but there has been so much nonviolent resistance. The first Intifada was largely characterized by nonviolent protests steered by committees that were often steered by women. And I just think the resilience of the Palestinian people is unparalleled and beautiful.
That's exactly what I was going to say is I hear people say, well, if they just had a nonviolent movement, if they just had an MLK, if they just tried this and that, and like they've been doing this whole time. And there's beautiful documentaries about it. There's beautiful movements that with Israeli people, where they're trying to fight for peace and justice for Palestinians together. There is a rich history of that, and I wish people learned more about that.
Awesome, y'all. Well, that brings me to my last question. I would love to know what resources you have used that have really resonated with students on this topic.
For me, the things that I think the kids really reacted to were I had letters between Israeli children and Palestinian children during, I think, the first or second Intifada, as they could hear from a kid's perspective how the thing impacted their lives and compare. And then video footage being like the second best to going there. And so for kids to see what Hebron was actually like, to hear how people were treated, how people were abused, even children were abused, how they had to put nets over the streets because Israelis were throwing garbage at them, and how they couldn't walk down certain streets and their doors were welded shut, so they had to go through the roof and through the back, and like they saw it with their own eyes. I showed them interviews with Palestinians, interviews with settlers in the occupied territories, and they could hear their perspective from their own voice. I think that was really impactful for a lot of students.
I want to shout out. So, my friend and mentor, Bill Bigelow, created a lesson called The Seeds of the Violence, which is about the early days of Zionism. So, it's a role play with 17 different roles of people who are affected by Zionism in some way, whether, it was like Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, or Palestinians who are being kicked off their lands, or Jewish people who oppose Zionism, or anti Semitic people like Lord Balfour who supported Zionism. And students do this role play, and then they decide what is at the root of this conflict. I think that was really an amazing lesson, and Sierra is going to drop that in the chat. And then also the documentary Promises. It's old. It's from like 2002, but it's the conflict through Palestinian and Israeli children's eyes and perspectives. And I think just the children part, my students really connected to those kids, and it really centers everything in humanity. So that's too.
Beautiful.
I would say, so I taught the conflict through a framework of multiple narratives. And I think that idea that it's not two sides, right? People hear Palestine, Israel, and they think, oh, there's two sides to the thing. Oh, no. There's multiple and many stories. And then the idea that facts are not the same as people's truths, right? That like it's facts are facts, and really learning how to separate that from what becomes people's truth.
I would say I love primary sources and I love teaching in real time. And so when I taught at an Islamic school during 2011, there were Palestinians in the West Bank who decided that they wanted to emulate the freedom riders who tried to desegregate here in the, who got on buses to desegregate busing and interstate travel. And when that was happening, I actually streamed it live in my classroom because I wanted students to be able to see A, Palestinians resisting nonviolently, but B, that interconnectedness of they're doing something that they saw African Americans do during segregation, and they're implementing that same strategy in Palestine, and so, or I should say the West Bank. And so I think that it's always important for students to either like view history as it's happening and reading documents, primary source documents, so that they can see for themselves what happened during that time period.
Yes. Well, I just want to first tell the audience no one should leave yet because we want to make sure you fill out a reflection on this conversation, but I want to tell everybody that this has been so beautiful and inspiring, and I'm really moved by the courage of all of you to teach the truth about Palestine in such difficult circumstances, and it's having a real impact. We're seeing more and more teachers unions pass resolutions for a ceasefire. We're seeing consciousness grow and our movement continue, and you all are an inspiration to me. So thank you so much for teaching me so much this evening. It means a lot to me. I look forward to working with you all soon, and I want to turn it over to Sierra to bring us home.
Thank you, thank you, thank you to all of our panelists, to Susanna, to Nassim, to Samia, to Kazaya. Thank you, Jesse, for facilitating and moving through this powerful conversation. I'm feeling inspired, and I hope that everyone is leaving with a renewed sense of solidarity, because we need all of us. We need all of us in this fight so that we can all be free. Thank you so much to Tierra Carter and Crystal Butler for being our ASL interpreters this evening. I appreciate you. Thank you to everyone who showed up today in solidarity with one another, for the educators on this panel, so that we could learn. The chat is going off, and you all are sharing resources and ways to follow up with one another and to continue to engage. And that, for me, is so powerful and so inspiring. And so before we leave, I just want to share that we need to continue these conversations. We need to continue to be in community, whether it be virtual or in person, to learn, to share, to strategize, to dream, to envision, to enact, to create. And so please share the Spring Teach Palestine issue with your colleagues, with union members, with students, friends, to engage in political education and critical dialogue. Use the issue as a resource for teaching about the roots of violence in Palestine and challenge the dominant narrative. You can also save when you buy copies of the Teach Palestine issue in bulk. So buy lots of copies, share them, share them, share them. It means so much to us as we continue to try to share these resources as much as possible. And again, thank you to everyone who offered a solidarity donation. That truly means so much to us to have your support. If you haven't already, please consider donating to make more events like this accessible and available to more educators and activists. We need you, and we need your support. And your donation directly impacts the expansion of our work. Again, thank you, thank you, thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Let's continue to strategize, and let's all get free.